You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, everybody. Al Bielawski with another edition of Catholic Spiritualism and Mysticism, where we talk about all things Catholic, the supernatural aspect of our faith, and all other relevant topics. And we're going to talk about one of the heroes of the Catholic Church a little bit in the show. But I just wanted to open up with something I saw. So I saw an interview with some individual from Catholic for Joe Biden, and I just want to comment on a couple things, because if you were aware, last week's show we were talking about the non-negotiable issues as a voter that a Catholic must, according to the Church, adhere to. And what struck me as interesting is that Catholics for Biden, they had an event, and it included Senator Dick Durbin, Sister Simone Campbell, and various other speakers. And just a couple things here. They urged this group to Catholics, where they feel it's about 20% of the vote, especially non-decided. So Catholics are going to have a big say in this election. And what they had to say was that Catholics shouldn't be single-issue voters on abortion. And then they wanted to challenge President Trump's pro-life record. But I just want to point out a couple things, that non-negotiable means just that. Now, Senator Dick Durbin, I don't want to get into attacking people or anything like that. There's enough of that going around. I think we all know that. But, in 2004, he was prohibited from receiving Holy Communion in his home diocese of Springfield, Illinois. And in 2018, that still was in effect by the Bishop Thomas Paprocki of Springfield. Non-negotiable means just that. Now, a couple of things I'd like to say here before we get into it is that this group tends to use one of Pope Francis's apostolic exhortations that I believe it was Gaudete et Exsultate, that said all human life, born and unborn, is sacred. And, of course, this is true. And the Pope had said that defense of the innocent must be clear, firm, and passionate. But, sometimes we can take, in these groups, things in a different context that we are. Now, the Pope, if you've read Laudato Si, or this particular exhortation, that he talks about the poor, the destitute, the underprivileged, and, human trafficking, forms of slavery, and that we must reject this in every form of shape, size. And that includes euthanasia. So, what they do is they take something like a word equally sacred, and you can use that to send defense for your particular candidate, your particular stand on an issue, and who you will vote for. But I just want to also point out that, while this group uses Pope Francis's words and says that abortion is not the only issue that matters, let's take a look at this. Because, for one thing, Pope Francis has come down pretty hard against people that are for abortion. And he minces no words about that. He has made forceful denunciations of abortion. And he has likened it himself, these are his words, hiring a hitman. And he has condemned selective abortion of the disabled. And he compared that to this, and I quote, the same as the Nazis who maintain the purity of the race, but with white gloves. And, he also, in Evangelii Gaudium, wrote that the defense of the unborn life is closely linked to the defense of each and every other human right. So, again, we've got to be careful when certain groups look to take things out of context or use certain, quote, sound bites for their agenda. Now, when we did the show last week on non-negotiable, the 5 non-negotiables, I mentioned that, it's abortion, euthanasia, cloning, homosexual marriage, fetal stem cell research. Non-negotiable means that. It means non-negotiable. So when you have a candidate, and in this case, obviously it's the Catholics for Biden, the candidate is Joe Biden. Biden has pledged to support taxpayer-funded abortion and actually codify legal abortion. Now, don't forget, his public option health care plan would also cover elective abortion. The National Abortion Rights Action League has endorsed his candidacy, as well as Planned Parenthood. And they said they were absolutely thrilled that his selection of a vice president was Kamala Harris. So, again, non-negotiable. And here, Joe Biden has said that he will force the Little Sisters of the Poor, who won their court case in the Supreme Court, to fund abortions if he's elected and reinstate Obamacare. So we've got to be very careful here about how we look at these issues. Because if you're a Catholic, and a Catholic vote, I believe, and many do, will be important in this election, it may be the decider. As a practicing Catholic, we really need to look at these issues and see if we are paying attention to the non-negotiable issues that determine how we vote as a Catholic. When we make choices like this, it's very easy to justify because we may see some type of good coming out of an end. But we must be very, very, very cautious with this because we can trick ourselves. And make no mistake about it, the devil is very good at packaging things that look pretty to get us to fall. And only when we fall and we get into trouble do we realize it's a little late. Another thing, if you want to talk about multiple issues besides taking care of the poor and feeding the hungry, and that's all important. Social justice is a big part of the Catholic Church, but it's not, it shouldn't be the number one. Number one is the salvation of souls. And you can't sanction murder, whether it's those in the womb or the elderly. You can't. There's really no getting around it. That's why it's non-negotiable. Another thing that this particular group does not mention in its particular voter materials is religious freedom. As I mentioned just a moment ago, he said he would repeal new religious exemptions to that contraceptive mandate which the Little Sisters of the Poor want. So he would force them to go against their Catholic faith and belief. And he also supported the Equality Act, which would create broad anti-discrimination protections for sexual orientation and gender idea that the U.S. Bishops' Conference has warned would threaten religious freedom. So, when you're hearing things like this, and I know, we're working out there, we've got family responsibilities, there's so many things going on in our society between the pandemic and all the politicking. But religion and politics are the two most important things that predicate our lives. And we need to really pay some attention to what's going on and not just a quick soundbite. We need to really look at these issues really with a well-formed conscience, which if you're Catholic, the church and Jesus' teachings and the church that upholds that teachings guide you in that conscience to make a good decision. And we must be very careful of this and look the way and pray about these decisions. Because, like it or not, today there seems to be this feeling that there's something called universal salvation, where there's no one in hell and everyone gets to heaven. And it just wipes out any thought or teaching of divine justice. But we are held accountable for our actions, even though in society, it seems today, many of us are not. But we will be, because we're not going to change the truth of God. And we are going to be held accountable for things we do. That is true. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear it. That's a tough thing to hear, especially in the society we live in today, where there is no accountability. You're off the hook for pretty much everything. But that's not the way it is. That's not the way it is. And it's very hard to argue against President Trump right now and all the pro-life things he's done and the religious liberty protections he's done. Don't forget, Joe Biden has said he will appoint liberal judges that will manipulate that Constitution and not adhere to it. Well, President Trump has come through with justices that are not activists, which is important. They are supposed to interpret the Constitution, not the activists from the bench. So anyway, just a couple of things on that. And I'd like to get into, I just feel compelled to talk about that because Catholics, again, I think are going to have an important say in this election. And this really election, I know, we've heard this so many times, but if you really look up and think about this and pray about this, it could very well be for the soul of this country. And we need to really take that seriously, because if we lose our religious liberty and our freedoms are restricted, and who would have thought they'd be restricted right now with the coronavirus as long as they have been right now, and some of the things we've taken for granted could slip away, because freedom costs. And in years past, it cost many militaries the ultimate sacrifice. So with that in mind, let's get on today with today's show with the main topic, because I just want you to kind of picture for a moment if everything fell apart. Everything. Our towns, our shops, no access to water, no access to electricity. Schools were out, churches, that there was unrest in society, fighting, growing more and more superstitious, mistrustful, and things just going to pot with no end in sight. And everything in ruins. Well, we're not actually talking about the time we're living in, but a different time. And imagine then if we were put into a position where we could put it all back together, and even use today, our time, if you could do that right now, what would you do? Where would you start? Because you know what? What we're going to talk about now really did happen. And it happened after the fall of Rome. And things were very, very brutal. Brutal. Until a king came along and was willing to do the work necessary to change things, what seemed to be on an impossible course from any change at all. And his name was Karl, and he was a Frank. And of course, he was one of the race of the people, Franks, that France was later named. But that was going to be a long time in the future. And Karl, who would later become well known, and you may recall hearing this name, Charlemagne, when he lived, of course, there was no such thing as France or any other country in Europe. There were just kingdoms. And King Carl, he was a tall man, and he was big, he was strong, and he had a lot of courage, and he had a lot of fortitude, and he was going to need it. And he was humble because he always dressed in the simple clothing at that time, which was just a plain old jerkin like a vest, a shirt, and leggings. And of course, this was the ordinary clothes of the men of his time. You see, it took time, and he had servants to get set up and dressed up as a king and to pay attention to all the pompadour. And you see, he felt he was way too busy. He had so many things he had to address that he couldn't waste time with all the pomp and circumstance. But he had piercing eyes and a big nose, and he had energy, tons and tons of energy. And it was he had to have that because he would need it to serve him well. Now, 300 years or so before he was born, the Roman Empire, what historians consider the greatest empire that ever was, fell. Despite all their military, despite their wealth, their power, their politics, everything that they had going for them for such a long period of time, they crumbled from within first. And you see then, and the famous saying, the barbarians at the gate, they were overrun by those tribes of barbarians. You know, a funny thing, that barbarians at the gates, as they wore, the people were still entertaining themselves, oblivious to what was about to befall them. How sad. How sad. But when the barbarians took over, and over a period of years, of course, everything the Romans had built went into ruin. That's the time that Charlemagne was going to deal with. And of course, this time was known as the Dark Ages. So named because people were so busy just trying to keep alive and surviving and fighting off enemies. They had no time for much of anything else. Think about that. If our society broke down like that, where it would just be a day-to-day existence, just trying to stay alive, to find water, something to eat, to avoid gangs, to avoid people that wanted to take anything that we might have, whether it be the shoes on our feet, a piece of clothing we wore, what have you. And it would be a very difficult time. Very difficult. And we could never say never. Because many times, you know, our Lord spoke in Scripture about they who exalt themselves will be humbled. So we have to be careful with that. All of us, individually and then as a society. So when things were just as bad at this period of time as they could get, King Carl, and he later would become the Holy Roman Emperor, he decided he wasn't just going to sit around and complain. No. He was going to do something about this situation. Now, he was not actually born a prince, and his father was not a king. His family actually came from a family of mayors of the palace. And they, remember, these were kingdoms now. They were the people who ran things for the lawful Frankish kings. Now, we've mentioned this on a couple other shows, and this was in the year around 732. Charles the Hammer Martel, now he was one of these mayors. And he was the one, and this was a miraculous victory. We've mentioned it before. You can check it out on some of the archive shows, that he drove back the Moors into Spain, who were trying to take over and probably would have stamped out Christianity way back in the 700s. But he won that miraculous battle. And his son, who was Pepin the Short, he was later made a king. And the royal family, and they were known as Merovingians, never did anything much. Matter of fact, they were asked by the Pope to retire. So these Merovingians, they were just kind of useless. Now, luckily for the people at this time, though, Pepin the Short was about 10 years old, Karl was only about 10 years old when his father, Pepin the Short, was crowned king of France. And that was at least a good thing that came from Pepin the Short's reign. Because when he died, Karl and his brother were expected to rule together, but that didn't work out too well. And after Karl's brother died, King Karl finally got busy. So he ended up fighting over 60 major battles to protect his kingdom and make it larger. Think about that. This was brutal hand-to-hand fighting. And this was in a time that this was just how it was. We can look back on with our 21st century mentality and look down and see the brutality in man's inhumanity to man. But, we have to be careful with that because we do a pretty good job with that on each other. So this is just the times they were in. And it's easy to look back and condemn when we didn't have to go through the things that this particular people did in that time frame. So he had a 47-year reign. And again, mentioning 60 major battles, and in his 47 years, in all directions, he had enemies and people that sought to destroy what he had made, whether they be the Slavs, the Avars, the Moors, as we mentioned, the Vikings, or the Saxons. And he couldn't lose a battle, or it was over. And we know some of those groups, such as the Moors and Vikings, were very, very formidable, very formidable. Now, King Karl actually never saw Rome until there was a military campaign against the Lombards of Italy. And after that, he was often called on to defend the Pope. And to his credit, he knew his mission. And he never let the Holy Father down. And he loved Rome. And you know what he loved especially? The Basilica of St. Peter. And he helped out because he loved that church so much that he would often send gold to help decorate it. Now, in the year 800 on Christmas Day, the Pope officially crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this was huge because King Karl now, by being the Holy Roman Emperor, meant that he wasn't just the king of the Franks anymore, but the protector of all the Christians in the West. And this was a huge job, huge undertaking, and luckily, or actually blessed the people that he did. And he knew, as an emperor, that a lot of things had been lost when the Romans fell apart. And it's funny because, he wasn't a very well-educated man himself, but he had determination. And he was convinced and would do everything in his power to build that back up. So what did he start with first? The education of his own children. And he set up a school in Aachen. And that's where he lived when he wasn't, of course, leading his armies in the field. So he starts with the education. And he also wanted to learn. So he persuaded a number of wise men at that time and scholars to come to his court and teach him You see, again, in his humbleness and humility, he could accomplish with God great things. And one of these, the best among them, was a man named Alcuin. And he came from England. And in England, at that time, a lot of classical learning has been preserved. And classical learning at that time was very important. Actually, I guess, in my opinion, it should be still important today. And the school taught all kinds of things: grammar, languages, writing, math, and, of course, religion. And when Charlemagne had the time, he sat in on those classes. And he could read. And he spoke Latin. And he could understand Greek. And he tried very, very hard. And even though he could read and speak these languages, he never did learn how to write. And again, he wasn't swayed by power, and he was a humble man, and that meant that he would not keep all of the learning that he had just for his family and keep that status quo, because what he wanted to do and did was he set up schools all over the realm that would teach boys and girls to read, and he took it further and also established schools that would train priests. Now, like today, and the rest of society at that time, the church suffered a lot over those past few centuries. And many of the clergy at that time, to put it bluntly, were quite ignorant. And we know that even the Vulgate Bible at that time was not always copied accurately. And to correct that in the different churches that they had would be a tremendous undertaking, tremendous. But that's what Charlemagne, the emperor, ordered to be done. And while he was ordering that to be done, he wanted the bishops to visit all the churches in their diocese. And he wanted them to preach. And he wanted them to start overseeing the priests. So here he's not only going to help with the education and the learning and wiping out that ignorance, but now he wants a hands-on approach. He wants some order and stability. Get back into the church. And another thing that he had done was to have the laws at that time written down. Because, like so many times in any country, the different nationalities at that time had their own particular way of doing things. And there was no reason really to interfere if they didn't make trouble. But those laws at that time were in such disarray that there was no cohesiveness. And you had this not unity but disunity. So he would ask advice from the bishops at that time on how to establish new laws, and made it so they were added to the old ones, so there would be some unity and cohesiveness and a foundation to build off of, so society could start to unify. And he built, many cathedrals and churches, especially one at Aachen, where he lived. And for those he could not build, the ones that were in disrepair, he repaired them. Hundreds of them. And he built a great bridge over the Rhine River. And he wanted a navy, so he built fleets of boats. Because again, at this time, he had to fight off enemies. The north were the Danes, and the south were the Moors. So always, despite doing all these incredible things, he still had to be aware to protect his country from its enemies. And he helped the common people at that time, especially farmers, because he knew that with a good industrious farming, people would be able to eat, and they would be fed, and there'd be enough food for everyone. And he encouraged trade, and he tried to make that trade safe when people were traveling from one place to another. No small feat when you have so many enemies and so many barbarians, so to speak, at the gate. Now, he died of a fever at the age of 72. And one of his sons, who was known as Louis the Pious, became an emperor after him. And he managed to keep this new light of civilization going on for quite a while, until the middle of the 800s or so. And like so many times in our history as human beings, so many times when we look at the Old Testament and see this with the Jewish history, that things began once again to fall apart. And it's rare when we see an individual with such unusual ability and energy become that's combined and has such a great devotion to the faith, to God and the church, such as Charlemagne. And that being said, his successors just couldn't keep up with all the things that Charlemagne wanted to do and to set in motion. And they used to have a saying back in the medieval ages, and it applies here to the early years, that as the king, so the people. Because after this time period in the years, times were hard once again. And through good kings beginning to come back into the forefront, pagan tribes were able to be converted. And Charlemagne, thankfully, wasn't forgotten. Now, he's never been officially canonized. At that time in history, though, many people did think he was a sage, and they prayed to him for help. And we can't get away from the fact that Charlemagne's reign was like a beacon shining out in the dark and lighting the way to great triumphs, especially in the 13th century when we see so many famous cathedrals and universities that were founded and cathedrals built. It's when also St. Thomas wrote the Summa. And of course, St. Francis and St. Dominic each founded one of the two famous religious orders, that of the Franciscans and Dominicans. And, you know, Christendom has had to fight really for its existence from the get-go. And it's no different today. And great things can happen when we stay close to God and trust in Him and adhere to His will and not our own. You know, Charlemagne did so much that we need to realize that God can raise people like Charlemagne, people like St. Joan of Arc, St. Francis, St. Dominic, St. Catherine Siena, the list goes on, and folks like you and me to do great things, and we can accomplish what seems to be impossible. Now, our times definitely are filled with a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, but you and me can change things and make things for the better. And we can never give up that hope, because as long as we have faith in the Lord and continue to walk in His path, walk in His ways, there's no stopping us on what we can do. You know, an interesting thing is that in the year 1000, Emperor Otto III actually entered Charlemagne's tomb at Aachen. And he found that the emperor had been buried, sitting up on a marble throne wearing a crown and robe. And the body was quite well preserved. And he had the book of the Gospels open on his knees. And some say he was also holding a scepter and a sword. And how right that is for him. A man that loved God, loved the church, loved Christendom, protected it. But the important thing to take from Charlemagne is that ordinary people with God can do amazing things. So when we get all tied up and worried about the time you and I are living in right now, let us remember that, as the angel Gabriel told Mary, with God, nothing is impossible at all. So we must keep our faith, keep our hope, and just keep persevering. And that brings us to another hero I'd like to mention of the Catholic faith today. And this is going to be an unusual one, a not well-known one. And his name was Charlemagne and Gozon. And he's known, okay, now here's where you might raise an eyebrow, as the Dragon Slayer. Now, before we dismiss the dragon part of the story, we did a show on cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals like the Loch Ness Monster and the Yeti and Sasquatch, and Bigfoot. That while these are great mysteries, and there are many skeptics, and a lot of evidence points that these animals do not exist, but if they are found, it certainly does not disprove the existence of God. That was the basis of the show. It's an interesting show, I think, on that, cryptozoology. That with every myth, with every legend, and this is one thing skeptics and scholars tend to miss, there are truths. So we've got to be careful, again, as I mentioned earlier in the show, about dismissing things with our 21st century mentality. Because we can get in trouble when, unlike Charlemagne, we are not humble, don't have humility, but look down and actually consider ourselves enlightened. And, you know, the Knights of St. John, or the Hospitallers, as they've been known, they've had an amazing and rich history of defenders of Christendom. Because, you know, as we just said, Christendom has always had to fight for its existence. And it will. It will in our age, and it will pass. And I want to just say, when the Knights were established, a short time after the Knights of St. John were established, and this was at Rhodes, they discovered there was a fantastic creature sharing the island with them. Now, several eyewitnesses at that time described it as a dragon. Now, again, before we dismiss this as merely fairy tales and myths, all I ask is that we consider what eyewitnesses reported. Because many times, and I'll be the first to say that in many times, especially in nature, nature can trick you. I think if you talk to most hunters, they'll tell you a story or two about how a bear or deer or elk or some type of animal they were hunting actually turned to be into a stump. But many of our eyewitness accounts in that cryptozoology that lead to stories of the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and these other unknown animals. So, as incredible as it may seem to us, can we say with such certainty that such creatures don't exist and may exist in places unknown to us, even certainly in our own time? You know, many times we miss animals, we don't see them. We don't see many times when in India where tigers are in the high grass, they're disguised so well with the markings, the stripes on their body. How many times have we almost stepped over a snake in tall grass? So we're unaware of things many times. So we will, for this show, consider that option when we're talking about de Uduan de Gozon. So with an open mind, let's look at this. So they have a creature on this island, and it was real enough for the people of Rhodes that whenever it appeared, it would leave behind a gruesome path of destruction, because it attacked and ate whatever victims it chanced to find. So the people at this time, and that's what we're going to go on, were very terrified, because something was not only killing them, but devouring them. And they were in great fear on this island in Rhodes. Now the people thought it had a hidden lair, which was thought to be in a deep pit at the foot of the mountain of St. Stephen, because they surmised that the animals that strayed in that region and they went there to drink water, they turned up missing. And when the shepherds went, they too went missing. And even pilgrims that would make that pilgrimage to the chapel of St. Stephen, and it was located high on that mountain, they frequently disappeared without ever arriving at the chapel. Now, in a gallant effort to rid the island of this creature, there was a valiant knight of St. John. And these knights, one after another, because they were so brave and took it upon themselves, these knights of St. John, they would ride out to slay this dragon. And one after another, no matter what night it was, they died in their attempts. And of course, this demoralized the Knights of St. John, as well as the people of Rhodes, because there was no way, it seemed, anyone could succeed, because this dragon was covered with scales, and they said it was harder than steel, invulnerable to arrows, spears, and even the swords of these brave knights. Now, after the losses of many of these good knights, the Grand Master, Leon de Villeneuve, forbade any of the knights from risking their lives again, because he said it's futile. It's a futile attempt to kill this dragon. And whatever this fearsome creature was, it seemed well beyond any knight's power to subdue it. And that's where this young knight, St. John, Charlemagne and Gozon, knew the entire truth of the existence of the dragon. And at one time, he himself had ridden out against it. And even though he faced the horror of the serpent-eyed monster with all brave intent, he had become frozen with fear and turned away from his quest. So he knew something about this creature, because he was struck by such fear that he decided not to fight, but to run. And this is a very difficult thing, because we know these knights, they had a code of honor. And he broke that code when he turned away. His brother knights had chosen victory or death. And they lost their lives, but they retained their honor, which is so important to the knights at that time. That's hard for us to grasp today. And he did return to the priory with his life. But what he had lost was his honor. And Gozon soon found that even though he was alive, he could not live with himself and the shame he brought upon himself. Now, he decided to take a leave from his brethren at Rhodes, and Gozon returned to his father's castle. But you know, it's the old, you can walk 1,000 miles and not go very far, because our own being, us, who makes, who we are, what we have become, what we choose to be, always follows us, no matter how we try to run from it. And even returning to his father's castle, he was haunted by this failure. And the image of that dragon would often invade his dreams. So in essence, he had no peace. Can you put yourself into his place for a while? How many times have we set out with a good intention, with a quest, and because of a stumbling block or fear or whatever obstacle was put in our place, we took the easy path out? All of us are guilty, I would imagine, at some moment in our lives. And we have no peace with that. And brothers and sisters, it's difficult to live with that, isn't it? We try to press it down in our subconscious, but it's there. It's haunting us. And then Gozon knew something that I think many of us do at times, that he would have no rest until he faced his fear and redeemed his honor. And for Gozon, it meant only the death of the monster would make things right and blot out that offense against his chivalry. Now, the knight was fully aware of Grandmaster Villanueva's prohibition against fighting that dragon, but he was more aware that he needed, in his own eyes, to redeem himself. And this was very important to him. And many times in our lives, it's the same thing. Now, he returned to challenge that dragon. And see, he had one advantage that the other knights didn't know. Because he had actually seen this creature, this horrible creature. And it had sharp fangs and a lashing tail. And it was, of course, unlike anything Gozon or the other knights had ever encountered before. And this creature had a foul scent, so much so that Gozon's horse fought the reins, trying to escape from this creature, this dragon's very presence. And if Gozon hadn't been an excellent horseman, he would not have been able to remain in that saddle. Now, in the days that followed Gozon, when he made this decision, he began to construct a detailed likeness of the dragon, and it was fashioned from common materials. And he worked steadily, and he closely followed the image of what he had seen of this dragon in his mind's eye. And he had managed, when he was finished, to actually capture this dragon's fearsome aspect. Even Gozon's horse shied away from the image that Gozon had built. And he studied this. And he looked at his enemy, this model he had made. And he looked at the scales, and he looked at the tail, and he looked at the teeth and claws, and then he knew that any weakness that this dragon would have would be on the underside. For he had seen this. That's where the overlapping scales didn't protect it. Of course, the problem would be getting past the jaws and the tail and the claws to get at that vulnerable spot. And Gozon had a thought come to him, a possible solution. And he scoured the countryside for a suitable pair of hounds. And he found them. And they were two huge mastiffs. And the knight now was formulating his plan and became satisfied that he may have found a solution to this problem. And what he did with this model was fill it with food. And thus he began to train these aggressive mastiffs to run under the creature to obtain the reward. So he was training them to get at that dragon's underbelly. And at the same time, the dogs became trained to get that weak point, that vulnerable spot. Gozon would mount his horse with his lance and charge directly at the statue, doing so again and again and again until he felt confident that his mount, being used to this model, would not rein back. So he prepared, and he prepared well. And then Gozon sailed back to Rhodes. And he went where landing would not be noticeable with his squires, so they arrived in secret. And he went, and they arrived undetected at the chapel of St. Stephen, where he prayed, and he commended himself to God. And he prayed that he would be ready for what he was about to do. And then Gozon went out, mounted his war horse, and released the mastiff. And he galloped down the slope as his huge dogs led the way. For they had picked up the stench of this dragon. And as the dragon burst from the tree line, Gozon's heart leapt, because this fierce and terrible creature fixed its eyes on Gozon. And the mastiffs, they ground and they bounded toward the monster. And of course, they momentarily distracted this enormous reptile. And Gozon, as he had practiced so many times, set his lance and raced across the open field toward his objective. And he prayed for that opening that he sought. And he was charging at full speed as he approached the dragon. And though the creature had turned away to confront the dog's vicious attacks, Gozon drove at what he believed must be a vital area, thinking that the scales could not resist the point of the lance, driven by the heavy weight of the charging warhorse. And the lance struck, and it shattered into dozens of splinters at that moment of impact. And it seemed to do no injury to the dragon. And the dragon howled with rage, and it wheeled on Gozon. And the horse, terror-stricken now, bolted and bucked in fear. And the agile knight, he had no recourse but to dismount. And he leapt from the saddle. And now he stood before this dragon. And he drew his sword, hoping only to strike a blow because he knew he was a dead man. But the mastiffs had not left their master, and they seemed to have no fear of this dragon. They continued to pounce and dodge and weave and bite, deftly avoiding that tooth-filled mouth and buying valuable time and distraction to aid Gozon. Now, the knight seized the opportunity, and he swiftly moved in, and he struck at the monster's neck with all his might. And Gozon's sword rang as the blow was deflected by the scales. And he kept on ducking and rolling to each side to avoid those claws, and he knew his efforts were useless unless he could get to that vulnerable spot. But suddenly the dragon's tail whipped around, and it struck Gozon full in the body, and it sent him flying, and he was stunned by the blow. He had not, however, completely lost consciousness. And as the monster reared up over him, Gozon found he still held his sword clutched in his right hand. And Gozon stood unsteadily, bent beneath the creature, and it let loose a deafening roar in triumph because it was going to vanquish his enemy and destroy this pitiful human. And Gozon observed blood running freely from his wounds on the monster's bellies where his dogs had torn its flesh, and he knew now was his chance. With all his remaining strength, Gozon thrust the sword deep into those wounds, and he noticed that the blade bit deeply into that soft underbelly, and the dragon thrashed and kicked, swept him off his feet, but the knight refused to release the weapon, which he impaled upon the monster, and he continued to twist and turn that blade, hanging on, until finally the beast stilled and fell forward, shuddering as it died. Now, when there had been no sound from either Gozon or the dragon for some time, Gozon's squires ventured to wander near the scene of battle. There, they found their master sprawled on his back, trapped beneath the dragon. Now, Gozon lay perfectly still, his face pale and lifeless, as the squires pulled him from under the dragon. And to their relief, when they removed his helmet, they found Gozon laughing with relief, as he had indeed realized he had slain the dragon. Now, we're going to continue this for a little bit next week's show, because there's still a little more about this brave knight. But the lesson for us from this first part is that Gozon couldn't live with himself with what he had done. And he knew that he had to face his fears and fight the dragon to be redeemed. And it is no different than what we have done, that we have been shamed, and we need to be redeemed. And as Catholic Christians, one of the great things we have is that Jesus left us the sacrament of reconciliation. And that we too can face our fears by giving them to Christ, being absolved of all our sin, of all our fears, of all our shame in the sacrament of confession. And to walk out of that confessional prepared to face and defeat our dragons, and the big one that is so active now, Satan, in our society, in his temptations, in his wrath, and defeat him, and defeat those dragons in our lives And we will continue this on the next show and what happened to Gozon in the night after slaying the dragon. And may God be with all of us when we confront the demons and the monsters and the fears in our lives, to defeat them and stand tall with our God, armed, with Him by our side to protect us. Good night, and God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio, please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.